It's so tempting to think that they're the same. I mean, look, isn't this just a gold version of this? They've got like the same reed, they've got the same looking mouthpiece. Surely if you can play clarinet, you can just play sax. No. No, 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 no. They are so different. That is what this video is about. Let's look at the differences between clarinet and saxophone and examine along the way why you should never be playing one of these like one of these. Okay, before we start, let's just get a quick disclaimer out of the way. I'm perfectly okay at saxophone, but I am not the world's greatest clarinet player, okay? So do not consider me an authority on clarinet by any means, all right? All right, that said, let's talk about the first difference between clarinet and saxophone, and that is one of tone conception. On the clarinet, the idea is to have a rounded, pure sound with a very solid core. Some people describe it as like a core of granite, but without all the kind of fluff and extraneous noise. It's a very pure, solid, centered, and not bright sound. On saxophone, however, you want as many upper partials as you can to really get the brightness and airiness and breathiness and full sound of that instrument to shine. So the way that you approach your sound in clarinet is completely different from how you approach the sound on saxophone. And if you're a clarinet player and you approach the saxophone the same, as sometimes happens in classical, often happens with local saxophone teachers, and very often happens just with people who used to play clarinet and then switch to sax, you're going to get in hot water because you're actually looking for the opposite things. Clarinet, you're trying to shut down those upper partials and create that really strong core to your sound. And saxophone, you're trying to enhance all the frequencies across the whole spectrum, which means loosening off your embouchure and letting the reed vibrate as much as possible. That is not the case with clarinet. So what would happen if you play your saxophone with the clarinet tone conception? Well, let's find out. Here's what the clarinet, might sound like using a sort of clarinet-y type approach. Once again, remember, I'm not the world's greatest clarinet player. I think I might have just smashed that clarinet anyway. Okay, now if I play the soprano saxophone like a clarinet, in terms of tone conception, this is what you might get. As opposed to playing the saxophone with a saxophone conception, which is going to sound more like this. Instead of so you can tell straight away that when I play the saxophone like a saxophone, the sound is bigger, louder, the pitch is lower, there's more harmonics and frequencies, and it doesn't have that pinched quality that you get when you play like a clarinet. So one surefire way of making sure that you're playing a saxophone like a saxophone and not like a clarinet is to go and check out my Saxophone Success Masterclass. That will really teach you the essentials of what really makes a saxophone, quite apart from all the cool stuff about practicing, improvising, and all that kind of good stuff. So go and check out the free Saxophone Success Masterclass using the link there. All you got to do is fill in your email. It's my free gift to you. Okay, let's get back to it. The second major difference between a clarinet and the saxophone is one of physics. Okay, now Quite apart from the fact that a clarinet is made from wood and a saxophone is made from brass, they are completely different shapes. So in terms of the acoustics, the physics of the acoustics, a clarinet is classified as a cylindrical instrument because until you get to the bell area, it's it doesn't get wider. However, a saxophone is classified as not a cylinder but as a cone because this end of the saxophone is much narrower than this end of the saxophone, and it tapers up gradually. So a saxophone is a cone, a clarinet is a cylinder. Now that has interesting effects for the physics of the instrument. For example, when you play the lowest note of your saxophone, which is a low B flat, and you overblow it, it overblows to a note an octave above. However, on clarinet, when you play the lowest note, which is a low E, and you overblow that note, it overblows a 12th to an octave and a fifth above. So here's the saxophone lowest note. And that overblows an octave. Okay, that was using the same fingering, the low B flat fingering. Whereas on the clarinet, when you play that low E, and you overblow it, it overblows to a B, an octave and a fifth above. So the whole overtone series of both instruments is completely different, which means that you have to approach the DNA of the two instruments very differently. Now, there's also a very interesting effect when it comes to the materials and the physics in terms of volume and in terms of ease of playing low notes. On a clarinet, now I'm not going to get too much into the physics of this because it can get really sciencey really quick, but just as in terms of layman's physics, the acoustic energy of the clarinet is very much contained within the bore of the instrument. Now, this means that the clarinet is quite a quiet instrument. Not too much, relatively speaking, not too much of the sound is radiated out. A lot of it is reflected in. And I apologize to any physics experts here, okay? But that means that the low notes are very easy to play. Even a beginner can play the lowest note of the instrument with ease. And it's also extremely easy to play altissimo in clarinet. Every beginner can do that as well. However, on the saxophone, because the brass is more efficient at radiating that sound energy into the outside world, it's a louder instrument, but less of that sound energy is contained within the bore of the instrument, making low notes much more difficult to play. In fact, one of the biggest complaints people have about saxophone is how difficult the low notes are. And that is because we're a victim of our own success. The sound radiates out with this big, beautiful sound because we've got this brass, conical brass instrument. However, it does mean that when you come to play your low notes and when you come to play altissimo, they are real problem areas on the saxophone. But what you're going to have, that's why it was designed. It was designed by Adolf Sax to be a marching band instrument that would project as well as being as nimble and have the real sort of reedy sound of the clarinet. So saxophone is both a victim of its own success, but has that big sound that the clarinet doesn't have. Again, so they are two completely different things that the physics of the instrument dictate. There are many, many other differences between clarinet and saxophone, but for the third one I'm just going to dwell on and finish with today is the fingering. Now, the first obvious difference is because the clarinet overblows a 12th and not an octave, the second register of the clarinet, the fingerings, are different. So if you finger a low E on clarinet and you want to play an E the octave above, it is not the same fingering. So you need two completely different fingering systems for the different registers, and then bridging them are these throat keys, which are notoriously difficult to get around. So clarinet is like a really gnarly instrument to get around. However, on the saxophone, it overblows an octave, so the fingering in the first register is pretty much the same as the fingering in the second register for the majority of it, and all you do is press the octave key. You don't even need to press the octave key, frankly. there are also other differences in fingering between a saxophone and clarinet. For example, a saxophone has a bis key to play your B flat. That makes it very easy to go quickly between B flats and C's or B flat and anywhere else. A clarinet does not have a bis key. It's actually got an unofficial bis key, this key here, but it's not a key that you generally are taught to put your finger on. But yeah, that is the equivalent of a bis key on the clarinet. So apart from the bis key or lack of, the other thing which is different between clarinet and saxophone is this thing about the G sharp key. Now, if I play G sharp on clarinet and then go to F sharp on clarinet, I have to take my G sharp key off. If I don't, then this happens. However, on the saxophone, I can key my G sharp key down and I can play the F sharp without moving it. That makes the saxophone a bit easier to play in terms of fingering. And there are some other interesting things about the fingering of the clarinet. For example, the clarinet has actual holes in it that you have to cover with your fingers. Some of the keys have pads, but the main 6 holes and the thumb hole are actually holes. Now, if you don't cover them properly with your finger, it's like a leaky pad. It's not going to work. Whereas, as long as your saxophone's in good working repair, you can't fail to cover the keys on saxophone if you put your finger down because the pad does the work for you. Now, that gives the saxophone an advantage. But, of course, the clarinet then has the advantage that you can draw your fingers up the keys and do a smooth gliss, which is what happens in Rhapsody in Blue. Whereas you have to do that more with your throat and your voicing on saxophone. So that kind of, it's harder because on clarinet, because if you miss one of those holes with your fingering, you're going to squeak like mad. But it does give you the opportunity to do the glisses. So, and, you know, not to mention the fact that the fingering systems are different in the different octaves, which makes clarinet much harder. So that's another couple of differences between the clarinet and the saxophone. And there are other differences. For example, saxophone has these left-hand palm keys, which people don't like, but they're okay, really. And the clarinet doesn't. But it has a lot of different keys with your pinkies that are different from saxophone. And you can also do something on clarinet that you can't do on saxophone, which is you can play the low notes 2 different ways with 2 different pinkies. And on bass clarinet, you've got even more flexibility with the old teaspoons. Whereas on saxophone, you can only play those low notes one way. Like, imagine how cool it would be if on saxophone, instead of just being able to play a low B, you had an extra finger over here on your right pinky that could let you play a B as well as an alternate. That's what it's like on clarinet. That would just, say you're doing, you know, a B major scale, that would completely change the game. That would be super cool. So that's one, you know, slight advantage of clarinet. But in general, I think the fingering on clarinet is more difficult, even despite those advantages. So just to round up this whole, you know, clarinet not being a saxophone thing, many people start on clarinet either as a kid, and even if they didn't start on clarinet as a kid, many people are taught by clarinetists who then took up the saxophone and didn't make any readjustment when they switched. So it's very, very important that you do not treat a saxophone like a gold clarinet, because you're going to get a really, really nasty sound. And that is the number one failing that people have when they play saxophone. They bite too hard. And of course, one thing I haven't even mentioned yet is the angle. For clarinet, you have this, you know, steep angle that goes into your mouth. Whereas for saxophone, the angle is much more, I don't know, you wouldn't say it's more obtuse or more cute, but the angle is more straight with your face. Whereas clarinet, the instrument comes into your mouth at a completely different angle, which changes a lot of things. So you really have to adjust when you play saxophone to play the saxophone like a saxophone. Don't play it like a clarinet, because you will get a nasty sound. You'll be playing, you know, the only way, you know, the best way to play a B flat on clarinet is the side B flat. And that's a classic telltale of people that don't play saxophone properly, is not using the bis key for their B flats. So all these little things, all these little adjustments you have to make, you have to treat the saxophone as a completely different instrument. And if you don't, you're going to be in hot water and things are going to be nasty. All right, that is all we've got time for. I hope it's been a useful expose of why these two things, although they are both straight and they both have a mouthpiece that looks the same and they both have a single reed, they are not the same, okay? Like I mentioned earlier, go and check out the Saxophone Success Masterclass using the link there. There's bonus content inside the Inner Circle membership. And I might even play an excerpt, the first few bars of the Mozart Clarinet Concerto for you. If you join the Inner Circle, that's worth a membership, isn't it? If you bought me a coffee, thank you very much. If you want to buy me a coffee, you know what to do. And I am very, very grateful. Until next week, make sure you practice hard, practice smart, and enjoy your music. Oh, why didn't I think of doing this before? Sound with a solid smack my clarinet up. Oh my God, what am I doing? I can't even do it.